Henry Whitaker's garage smelled like a time capsule of sawdust, pine, and linseed oil, a fragrance that had once been as much a part of his mornings as the black coffee he sipped from a chipped mug. At 67, he'd spent decades hunched over his workbench, crafting furniture that told stories. Oak tables that bore the scratches of family dinners, rocking chairs that cradled restless infants, cedar chests that held a lifetime of keepsakes. But 3 years ago, when his wife Margaret slipped away after a long battle with illness, the tools went silent. The joy of woodworking, once as steady as his heartbeat, vanished with her soft voice, leaving Henry with a house too quiet and a heart too heavy to pick up a plane or a chisel. The garage became a mausoleum of unfinished projects, the half-built bookshelf in the corner gathering cobwebs like a monument to what once was. Henry didn't mind the solitude at first. He'd always been a man of few words, but the emptiness grew louder with each passing month. His daughter, Claire, noticed. She'd call, her voice bright but strained, asking him to come over for dinner or take a walk. He'd make excuses, preferring the company of his recliner and the hum of late-night TV. That was, until the summer Claire showed up at his doorstep with her 12-year-old son, Ethan, in tow. "Dad, he's been glued to that darn tablet all year," Claire said, her hands on her hips, worry creasing her brow. "I'd love for him to learn something real, something with his hands. Could you teach him?" Henry scowled, his gray brows knitting together. He wasn't in the mood to entertain a kid who'd probably rather be swiping at a screen than swinging a hammer. But when Ethan stepped out of the car, all lanky limbs and wide, curious eyes, something shifted. The boy didn't whine about the spotty Wi-Fi or the lack of air conditioning. Instead, he wandered into the garage, his sneakers scuffing the concrete floor, and stopped at that old bookshelf. "Did you make this, Grandpa?" he asked, tracing the rough edges with his fingertips. Henry grunted, caught off guard by the flicker of pride that warmed his chest. "Used to," he said, his voice gravelly from disuse. "Haven't touched it in a while." Ethan tilted his head, his brown hair flopping over his forehead. "Why not? It's cool." That word, cool, from a kid whose generation seemed to worship digital gadgets over anything tangible, hit Henry like a spark on dry tinder. It wasn't much, but it was enough to crack open a door he'd bolted shut years ago. The next morning, Henry dragged his old workbench into the sunlight streaming through the garage door and called Ethan out. "If you're gonna be here, you might as well learn something useful," he said, tossing the boy a pair of oversized safety goggles. Ethan caught them with a grin, and they started with the basics, measuring twice, cutting once, sanding until the wood felt smooth as a river stone. Henry's hands, stiff and creaky from neglect, remembered their old dance, guiding Ethan's smaller, clumsier ones to plane a piece of oak. The boy soaked it up like a sponge, asking questions that pulled Henry back through decades. Memories of building cribs for Claire when she was a baby, or the cedar chest he'd surprised Margaret with for their 25th anniversary, her eyes shining as she ran her hands over the polished lid. At first, it was just a way to keep Ethan occupied, to fill the long summer days with something other than the drone of video games. But as the weeks unfolded, Henry found himself waking up with a lightness he hadn't known since Margaret's passing. They built a birdhouse first, its crooked roof a testament to Ethan's beginner's enthusiasm, then a stool that wobbled until Henry showed him how to brace the legs. The garage came alive again with the whine of the saw, the tap of a hammer, and Ethan's endless chatter, Stories about his school, his buddies, his wild dream of becoming an astronaut. Henry listened, nodding along, and slowly he started talking too. About Margaret, how she'd hum Patsy Cline tunes while he sanded, how her laughter could brighten even the gloomiest November day, how much he missed her steady presence beside him. One sticky afternoon, as they smoothed the edges of a small table, Ethan looked up, his goggles fogged with sweat. "Grandma sounded awesome," he said. "I wish I'd known her better." Henry stopped, the sandpaper still in his grip. Ethan had only been 9 when Margaret died, too young to hold onto more than fleeting impressions of her. "She was," Henry said, his voice softening. "She'd have loved seeing you out here, covered in sawdust, making a mess." Ethan grinned, and in that moment, Henry felt Margaret, not as a ghost or a pang of grief, but as a gentle warmth, like sunlight spilling through the window. The real shift came when Ethan, emboldened by their smaller successes, asked if they could tackle something bigger, a rocking chair, like the ones Henry used to craft. "For Mom," Ethan said, his eyes bright. "She's always saying she wants one." Henry hesitated. Rocking chairs were Margaret's domain. They'd spent countless evenings on the porch, rocking side by side, watching the world wind down. The memory stung, but Ethan's hopeful face pushed him past it. "All right," Henry said, clearing his throat. "Let's give it a shot." It took 2 weeks of sweat and patience. They measured every piece twice, cut the runners with care, glued and clamped the frame, then sanded until their hands ached. Henry taught Ethan how to carve subtle curves into the arms, how to balance the chair so it rocked smooth and steady. When they finished, they varnished it together, the wood glowing like honey in the afternoon light. Claire's eyes welled up when they unveiled it, her arms wrapping around them both in a hug so fierce Henry thought he'd bruise. "You two are a team," she said, laughing through her tears, and Henry felt a swell of something he hadn't in years. Pride, yes, but also love. That night, Henry sat alone in the garage, his calloused fingers brushing over the tools he'd abandoned. He thought of Ethan's eager questions, the way the boy had breathed life back into this forgotten space. He thought of Margaret, how she'd always said love lived in the things you made for others. Teaching Ethan hadn't just given the kid a skill, it had given Henry a lifeline, a reason to feel the world again. The grief was still there, a quiet ache, but it wasn't a prison anymore. It was a bridge, connecting him to something new. At 67, Henry Whitaker had believed his best days were dust on the shelf. But that summer, amidst the hum of saws and the scent of fresh-cut wood, he learned a lesson his grandson didn't even know he'd taught. Love doesn't fade with loss. It shifts, it grows, it finds new shapes to fill. As he looked at the rocking chair they'd built, sturdy, beautiful, a gift of their hands and hearts, Henry smiled. He was ready to keep building, not just for Ethan or Claire, but for himself, for the years still ahead.